Boy, today I've got a great guest, an anthropologist. He lives in Cleveland. He is a teacher at Lee College, and I'm so interested in hearing about anthropology because I'm not exactly sure what it is.
We don't do that.
No insects.
No, we study people. It's just, what does it mean to be human?
Not bones.
We do that. That's part of what we do too. Anthropology divides into four major subfields. Archaeology, which is study of people in the past. And it also includes paleoanthropology, which is really, human origins in terms of biology and stuff like that. Then we do linguistic anthropology, study of language. We do cultural anthropology, which is the study of people in contemporary societies and their culture and the structure of their societies. And then we do biological anthropology, which is what does it biologically mean to be human? So I was fortunate. I got trained in all four of those fields of anthropology. I'm kind of a dinosaur nowadays. Most schools don't do that. Most anthropologists specialize in one field.
One of the four?
Yeah. And so, but I've been trained in all four. And so I do archaeology. I teach biological anthropology. But I also have a master's degree in linguistics, so I do linguistics too. And then, of course, my dissertation research was primarily cultural anthropology. I went to Egypt as a Fulbright scholar and studied Christian monasticism in Egypt and wrote my dissertation on that.
Boy, that's a lot of education.
Yeah, the thing about anthropology, the thing that's hard to wrap people's minds around is that we're kind of like, we provide a meta-narrative for everything that everybody does. So psychology does their thing, but we go one level higher and we study psychologists. So we have a meta story about what psychologists do. We have a meta story about what sociologists do. We have a meta narrative above all these other narratives, which makes us very annoying sometimes because we see things that people don't want to see. And we're always looking for that higher level of analysis, which is what attracted me to anthropology. It's the interview that you did with, and the conversation you had with Jerome Hammett, he talked about patterns. Totally agree with him about how the human brain is looking for patterns. Well, we're looking for the patterns that govern everything, not just that govern specific individuals or specific societies, but what are the bigger patterns?
Are there patterns?
Definitely, much bigger patterns. For example, if you look at human societies throughout, let's take this back and put it in a big context. Basically, anthropology is the study of context, okay? We're studying the context of contexts. And if you look at things like all human societies in all time, there's some surprising things that you discover. These are some things that sort of confirm to me that there has to be even a bigger context in anthropology, and I think it's a theological context. I'll get back to that in a minute. But when we look at human societies, we never find a human society anywhere in the history of the world that we know of where people just say, hey, it's okay to kill whoever you want. It's built into us not to do that. So ingrained in us, there are these sort of inviolate principles that are built into us that in order to, if we want to violate them, we have to justify violating them. So we can kill people, we just have to dehumanize them. Or we have to claim that it was okay because. But if we truly lived in a Darwinian universe where just people do whatever they want, why do we have to justify it? Why don't we just kill them?
So people have, humans and civilizations have always had the mindset that killing is wrong unless for a reason.
Right. We sometimes want to do it, so we justify it. But there'd be no necessity to justify it if we didn't know it was wrong.
Yeah. Why are we even justifying it if you don't have this inner thought that it's wrong?
Yeah, I call these universal moral imperatives that are built in all humanity. They're part of. It's built into us biologically, cognitively. We are programmed to behave in this particular way. And if we don't behave that way, we have to justify it. And it's not social, because if it was just socially constructed, this person does this person does that. Nazi Germany should be just as good as, our society. But it's not. We know that Nazi Germans and what they did was wrong. We know that. But the Nazis justified it by saying, well, these Jews really aren't human. We can kill them because the only real humans are the Aryans. And so we're justified in killing these people. And besides, if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler justified the whole thing. They're the canker worm at the heart of all the corruption in Europe. So we have to get rid of them to protect the health of, Europe. So there was a big justification for doing that. But if Darwin was right and there is no God and there is no structure built into us, we should just be able to kill people. Same thing with marriage. All human societies practice some form of marriage where you create social structure by bonding people together. When you deviate from that, you got to justify it. You got to say, well, it just didn't work out. There's got to be reasons and consequences for divorce, okay, for separation of these created social structures. Same thing with stealing. No human society just says, hey, it's okay, just go steal whatever you want. It's almost like most of the 10 Commandments that's just built into us. And we don't find any human society that just says, hey, whatever you want to do is fine.
How far back can you study civilizations and know that?
Well, we can go back to all the written records, 5000 BC, maybe all the way back to close to that anyway.
Is that when they started having written records?
Yeah, early Egypt, maybe 3500, 3200 BC. And we look at all these old societies and we look at non-Western societies that survived into the 20th century without a lot of European contact and stuff. We just don't find societies that are truly relativistic that just say, yeah, it's anything goes.
How old were the writings? What civilization was the earliest writings that they know? Was that the
probably Sumer? Yeah, a little bit before the Egyptians. So the Egyptians had lots of written records beginning about 3200 BC.
What did they write on?
Early on, it was a lot of religious texts. It was a lot of
Parchments stuff.
They wrote on ostraca, broken pottery. They also wrote on papyrus. They invented papyrus even before 3200 BC. So they were able to write on various surfaces. The Egyptians were consumed with a lot of religious writing. They were also consumed with a lot of keeping records kind of writing, how many bushels of wheat, that kind of thing. And same thing in Sumer. Sumer was mostly religious or bookkeeping kind of things early on. Then shortly after that, you get literatures get recorded and all this early, like the stories of the theological stories and then also narratives about people and stuff like that.
Is that what they mostly wrote about other than wheat records and stuff like that? Was it mostly religious text?
Yeah, at least in the Middle East, early on, it was religious text. Remember, you had a small group of highly trained people that could read and write.
Yeah.
And they couldn't waste their time doing a lot of stuff, so they did what everybody thought was most important, which was religion and bookkeeping. So
there wasn't much poetry or
not early on
writing stories.
But after more and more people learned to read and write, that stuff started to proliferate. So by the time you get to the middle of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, 2900 BC, 2800 BC, you've got lots of stories written that are sort of parable kind of stories and stories about ordinary people and that kind of stuff. And adventure stories.
Biographies?
Some of them are about people and about their lives, yeah.
Like Horace, wasn't that the guy that wrote a lot of, he wrote stuff that like the positive people say today and these positive messages and stuff. Horace really was saying that prior to them.
Oh, we talking about Herodotus?
Herodotus.
Yeah, he was a Greek historian. He's a little bit
people
later.
Call him Horace?
Horace was the son of Osiris and Isis, Egyptian gods. He was the god who went out and fought Set, the evil god, and lost his eye. So the eye of Horus becomes magical, a magical talisman. So he's part of the Egyptian pantheon of gods. I don't know of another Horus. But.
So anthropology is not necessarily finding bones of mastodons.
Oh.
Or it is part of the four things then that are under.
We certainly do archaeology. I do a lot of archaeology, and a lot of it's prehistoric archaeology. So I'm concerned with how people lived and how they interacted with prehistoric environments. That's what I do over here in the National Forest for the Forest Service, is we've been doing survey work for them for 20-some years. And one of the big projects we have is to survey this one area and look at what people did on the landscape between like about 10,000 years ago and about 8,000 years ago. I'm really interested in that period called the either the late Paleo-Indian or early Archaic, when people first settled here in Tennessee.
Which was about when?
It's between 5,000 BC, which is about 7,000 years ago, back to about almost 9,000 BC.
No record of humans prior to that? I mean,
yeah, we've got some earlier records in North America. We worked in Colorado for the Bureau of Land Management out there at a site that we have reliable carbon dates that go back to almost 12,000 years ago. So we're talking over 10,000 BC out there, right in the Paleo-Indian time.
How do you square that with the Bible? If the Bible claims that God created the earth, what, 8,000 years?
Well, the Bible doesn't, people claim that. Bible doesn't claim that. Bible doesn't put a date on any of that. And this leads to a thing that got me interested in anthropology. When I got out of high school, I went in the Navy for 6 years. Got one of the best engineering educations you can get anywhere in the world. I went to Naval Nuclear Power School, graduated from there, went to Knowles Atomic Laboratories, got certified there, then went and served on the USS Enterprise for the remainder of my enlistment. I was in for 6 years operating nuclear power plants there. So I got this great engineering education. And of course, at that time, I wasn't a Christian. And
what were you, just agnostic?
Yeah, pretty much an agnostic. I was raised in Church of God, but I just, it didn't bother too much. And then towards the end of my enlistment, I sort of had an encounter with God. I'm convinced of that, where I was up backpacking with a friend of mine who happened to be a Christian, another nuke in the Navy. We were backpacking up on the Queets River. And this is September 18th, 1980. And we woke up and the sky went black. And Mount St. Helens had just erupted. It was only about 90 miles from us, and the ash cloud came overhead. We heard the explosion, the sonic boom from it going off, and it started raining like crazy. And we barely got out of there with our lives. I had to swim across the Queets River, almost didn't make it, but I believe my deliverance was miraculous. And it caused me to question some things about, I knew all this science and everything, but my mortality, I hadn't really figured into all of that, okay? So that began a different kind of search. Well, I got out of the Navy not too long after that. I went to University of Michigan, and I was accepted in their engineering program and studied engineering for a while. But one of the courses I took when I was there was a course in anthropology. I'd never really thought about anthropology before. I'd been overseas, and I know I was really interested. I spent a lot of time in the Philippines and in Kenya, in Hong Kong, and these other places, and I was really fascinated with language and culture difference and stuff. My first exposure to it in my entire life. I mean, I was raised in Michigan, but hadn't really traveled anywhere outside the United States. My dad was from West Virginia, so I'd been back and forth to West Virginia quite a few times, but that was about it. It kind of opened my eyes to a bigger world out there. And then these questions of mortality came up, and right after that, after I took that course in anthropology, there was something about that struck a chord. I said, it was this bigger picture that wasn't just science, it was bigger than science. And it wasn't just religion, because I grew up in the Church of God and I was familiar with that teaching and that theology. It was bigger than that in a way, in terms of trying to see. I became a minister in the Church of God shortly after 1983. I got out of the Navy 80, became a minister in 1983. But I knew that if I was going to be a good minister, and my wife and I, best thing I ever did was marry my wife, Sheila. My wife and I did jail and prison ministry for 13 years in Michigan, and I was a state prison ministries coordinator. We worked with people who were incarcerated for various reasons, and that opened up a whole different side of society too. Sure. that I hadn't seen. So I saw all this stuff overseas. I saw the class and social differences between people here. I was trained as an engineer. I was also this religious specialist now. And I'd taken this course in anthropology and I said, how can I best help people? I said, let's be an anthropologist. I said, I could be a Christian minister and be an anthropologist. The goal was at that time maybe to go back in the military as a chaplain or to possibly be a missionary. And so I went into Oakland University in Michigan, got my undergraduate degree in anthropology and linguistics because I figured anthropology and language were the two things that would help me best to understand other people so I could help them. And then I went to Egypt as a Fulbright scholar when I got to my doctorate and lived and worked there and studied Coptic Christianity and monks in monasteries, wrote my dissertation on that. Then I came back and came to Lee not too long after that. And now, the program I was in was really good because it trained me in all 4 subfields of anthropology. So when I came to Lee, we were able to actually, Merle Dirksen and I were actually able to start an anthropology major and teach all 4 subfields. So I could teach biological and archaeology and linguistics. And Merle, who's primarily a cultural anthropologist and a very good one, he's a great ethnographer. We started the anthropology program, then we hired Alan Wheeler not too long after that as a 3rd anthropologist, and we've had a pretty good program for over 20 years now. So that's kind of what got me into this. But the big questions were, okay, who am I? What am I doing? How do we understand the world? I mean, I think anthropology provides a way to do that.
The big questions?
Yeah. Who are we? What are we doing here? Why are we so different, but why are we so similar? I mean, there's an underlying similarity to us, but there's also a lot of surface kind of difference. And of course, we pay a lot of attention to the surface differences and not a lot to the underlying similarities. We're all biological beings with the same genetic structure. You know, I mean, there really is almost an insignificant amount of variation genetically among humans around the whole globe. There's more variation within particular ethnic populations or geographic populations than there is between geographic populations, which means that this idea of any kind of races or anything is just wrong. There are no races. There are just one species. We're humans who just vary a lot. It's like saying there are different races of dogs. Well, no, there's just dogs.
You just call them dogs.
Yeah, and they vary a lot, but their genes are all the same. There's very little variation in their genes, just like in humans. So these are things, and then get back to the question about the Bible. You're asking about, well, how can I have all this old stuff when the prevailing notion is the earth isn't that old? Well, the earth does seem to be old. One of the things I became aware of as a linguist and anthropologist when I went and looked at the Genesis story is that those first 7 days of creation described in Genesis don't say an evening to an evening are a day. They say an evening and a morning were a day. But I know, I lived and worked in the Arab world, and I know that in the Arab world and in the Hebrew mindset, the ancient Hebrew mindset, a day is evening to evening. Their day starts at the evening and ends in an evening. It doesn't go evening to morning, that's a night. So you can't say that evening to morning represents a 24-hour day. It doesn't. It represents 12 hours. Or the word yom, which is the same in Arabic and in Hebrew, can mean period of time. And in fact, in other places in the Old Testament, yom is translated period of time. But the translators in King James English decided to make that a day. Okay, day can also mean an age, in the day of the Lord. Okay, doesn't mean 24 hours.
Or in the age of the Lord.
Yeah, so that word yom became translated in a particular way, and people have locked onto that as a literal interpretation. The Bible doesn't say you have to literally interpret that. We say that you have to literally interpret that.
So in the King James, the translation before used the word yom?
Well, the word in Hebrew is yom, and yom means day or age in Arabic or Hebrew. It depends on how you use the word. And if you're using evening and morning, you're probably not talking about a literal 24-hour day, because that's half a day.
Yeah.
You're probably talking about, in fact, the way that historically it's been interpreted in many places, many times, this isn't original with me, is that it was a dream that Moses had in a night. He dreamt about the first day of creation. He dreamt about the second day. And it was just a series of what God did. Doesn't put a time frame on it. It's just
say that part again. It was a dream of Moses.
Yeah, the book of Genesis is attributed to Moses. So when Moses wrote this,
Moses being the writer.
Right. And so Moses had this dream of creation given to him by God. And he had it on 7 different nights. And so he wrote it down, what God revealed to him on those 7 different nights. That's a very traditional interpretation. And so you're not locked into this 27 hour,
So
7 day.
almost Moses could have been saying, and on the seventh day he told me this, and on the sixth day he told me that. It wasn't might not have necessarily meant that God created the heavens and earth on this day
Right.
or their second day, or it could have been in this age.
Because as a
or in that
linguist,
age.
I know that we impose that 24-hour framework on there. The Bible doesn't impose that. We impose it. We carry that with us to the text.
Have you ever heard anybody say, if King James was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me?
I say it every day.
I mean, because he wasn't reading the King James.
No, he wasn't an American. He was, these books of the Bible were recorded, God speaking through people in their cultural context, right? They weren't Americans. They weren't modern people. They were ancient people.
Yeah, and in their social context.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we don't see in the Bible. This is what's irritating about anthropology, okay? For example, we see stuff that other people don't pay attention to. For example, I always go around in my Global Perspective class and ask them, how many of you are married to your first cousins? They all look at me like I'm stupid. And I go, come on. Well, you're young. How many of you plan on marrying your first cousins, right? Well, why not? Well, I get all these reasons. Well, it's just not right. You shouldn't do that. It's wrong, you know. Well, why is it wrong? Well, and eventually somebody will say, well, you know, it's just against the Bible. And I'm like, let's go to Numbers chapter 36. God commands the daughters of Zelophehad to marry their father's brother's sons to keep the inheritance in the family. In fact, the most common marriage pattern in the whole Old Testament is between first cousins. And in the New Testament, it's between first cousins. In fact, the most common marriage pattern in the world is between first cousins.
The most common. In Italy, it was very common.
Yeah. Why don't we do it here then?
Well, they don't want to lock in on that one, I guess.
No, they don't. We just don't think about it because our culture gives us this framework and we don't look beyond it. And we think looking beyond it, you know, is wrong.
Is that cognitive bias?
Certainly is. And so anthropology, we see this. We see that in ancient Hebrew society and many other societies, in fact, in the Middle East today, 50% of all Egyptians are married to their first cousins. Okay, so it's just a normal thing. We don't do it because of what happened in Europe during the Protestant Reformation. Actually, it was leading up to the Protestant Reformation. Was we had the Catholic Church, in order to maintain control in Europe, forbade first cousin marriage between all the royal people to break up those big landed estates in Europe so that they could keep control, okay, because they controlled marriage. Well, it's a Roman Catholic ecclesiastical law that comes to us through the Protestant Reformation.
Trying to control the masses.
Yeah, there's nothing in the Bible that prevents that. In fact, God commanded it in the Bible. No pastor I know has ever got up there and preached Numbers chapter 36 and said, all right, this is what God says, marry first cousins.
All because it doesn't say thou shalt.
Yeah, well,
In the Ten Commandments, was it the Ten Commandments, or in the earlier writings, was it the 10 sayings?
the word could be translated, I think, either way. Yeah. I'd have to go back and revisit. I haven't looked at that in a while, but I would say probably saying and commandment are close enough in ancient Hebrew that not that different.
Because commandment seems a whole lot more dramatic.
Yeah, it'd be the form of the verb probably would be,
Right.
you know, to the command form rather than.
Because they used some words but had different meanings of them as if you were using them for different verbs. Very complex. Seems like the study of language like that would be the hardest thing there is.
Oh, linguistics is tough, which is why everybody doesn't do it, especially when you start to compare languages, because first you got to learn something about, you know, the language and know your own.
And the society.
And the society that it lived in to really, the context in which the language exists.
In your opinion, can a person go to heaven on the King James?
Oh, sure. Why not? I mean, all of our churches, here's what I found out. When I went, and one of the reasons I picked the Coptic Orthodox Church to study was I wanted to study a church that has a history that goes all the way back to the 1st century.
They were really the first, right?
Yeah,
Coptic Christians.
because St. Mark went to Alexandria, founded a church there, and that church split into many other churches and becomes a Coptic Orthodox Church. So by 350 AD or so, Egypt is mostly Christian and is totally Christian by 451 AD and stays Christian until the Muslims invade in 642 AD.
So was they Coptic Christians?
They're Coptic Christians, so they're Orthodox Christians. There's a
What was their belief different than Baptist?
it's not that different. If you look at their creed, except for a couple of things that the Baptists would get upset about, or Church of God people would get upset about, we believe in one holy and apostolic church, and of course they say that's them, right?
Yeah.
Everybody
Says it's them.
But everything else, I mean, believing in the Trinity, believing in Jesus, that Jesus is part of the triune God, the Holy Spirit is active in the world. I mean, the virgin birth of Christ. All these are basic doctrines of the Coptic Orthodox Church. In fact, you can go right down here in Highway 11, just before you get to McDonald. There's a Coptic Orthodox church down there.
I've seen that. It's a nice looking building.
It is, and their liturgy is a little long. Be prepared to stand up for about 2 hours.
Oh, you mean their services?
Yeah. And but it's beautiful liturgy, and they read from the Gospels. They read from the Old Testament. They read from the letters in the New Testament. There'll be a short homily preached, about 15 minutes. We Church of God people and Baptists could learn something from that. But
our churches will preach for an hour or so, right?
Yeah, everything is basically they try to represent the totality of Christian belief in the gospel in their liturgy, and I think they do a pretty good job of it. I enjoy those liturgies. But what I found in there was that a lot of things that we approach the Bible with our cultural biases, and we interpret it according to that.
And can we even help that, really?
No, not to a certain degree, no. I mean, because everybody can't become an anthropologist and get a higher, context on this.
Yeah.
And so you can't be overly critical to the point where say, well, if you don't believe this, you're not gonna make it. I think God is much more forgiving than that. But I found some interesting dichotomies. For example, when I looked at the creation story, and I know, for me, looking at the science of it, the universe is an old place. The universe has been around for billions of years. I mean, we're seeing galaxies that are billions of light years away. That light takes billions of years to get here.
You don't think that goes against the God?
If God can exist forever, what does it matter to God? It only matters to us.
All because of that first chapter of Genesis, right?
Yeah, but then we carry a bias that says we want to make this 7 literal days. But if you don't make it 7 literal days, it's still inspired. And it still tells us God did it.
And everything makes sense then.
Yeah, then it makes sense because we do live in an old earth. I mean, and one of the things I get interested in, the Bible doesn't tell us about Native Americans. Well, they've been running around here since, well, now we have evidence that the first people came to North America probably 24,000 years ago. We found up in the Yukon, we found caves up there where large mammals like caribou and stuff have been butchered and cut up and stuff. And they date back to 24,000 years ago. So people,
and they found actual cut marks.
Cut marks and stone tools, yeah.
And what about the Mississippi?
Mississippian peoples?
Yeah.
Yeah, these came a lot later, but before Columbus ever got here, you had people who were, almost all the Native Americans were farmers before Columbus got here.
Do you think they came across from Russia over here on the land bridge?
Yeah, genetically we're pretty sure of that they're descended from primarily Asian populations, yeah, that migrated. There are probably 3 major waves of migration that came across the Bering Strait.
At different times.
At different times, yeah. But they liked it here. They flourished here. They spread all the way down into South America very quickly. By the time they got over here in Tennessee, we know, you go back to Paleo-Indian times around 8,000 BC, 9,000 BC, there were plenty of people living here in Tennessee. I mean, they weren't huge populations, but people were in here hunting big game.
Were they any tribal people or any names, or we just know
we don't know their names.
We just have evidence that there were people here at that long. Is it through carbon dating?
Yeah, through carbon-14 dating. And I have confidence. I know people criticize that, but remember, I'm a nuclear engineer. I know how that stuff works. The same principles that make carbon-14 dating work are the same principles by which we operate nuclear power plants. Things about half-lives and decay daughters of fission and how long they last and all this kind of stuff. We had to do calculate. Every time we shut a reactor down, we have to do a whole bunch of calculations before we start it back up. That's based on the half-life of various radioactive isotopes that are created when you're operating the nuclear power plant. Well, if half-lives didn't work and we couldn't do that, carbon-14 wouldn't work and nuclear power plants wouldn't work.
So carbon-14 dating is fairly accurate.
It's accurate back to it only goes back to 70,000 years, though. That's about the oldest dates you can get out of it.
I don't understand that you can't get past that in testing.
Well, if you start with carbon-14, which is an isotope of carbon, it's only part of the carbon that's in a thing. So you got carbon-12, carbon-13, carbon-14. They all have different numbers of neutrons that exist within the element that we call carbon. Well, what happens is when you're alive and you're eating food, you're taking in carbon. Well, that carbon has carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14 in it. Carbon-12 is very stable, doesn't decay. Okay, carbon-13 decays, but over a hugely long period of time. And we can't use it for dating because there's not enough of it in the sample. But carbon-14, there's a lot of it. Carbon-14 is created, every day carbon-14 is created in the atmosphere. Plants suck it in, animals eat it, we eat the animals, we eat the plants, we take it in. So all life on the planet has the same level of carbon-14 while it's living. But when it dies, it quits taking in carbon-14.
Oh, when the thing, even a piece of wood.
Yeah, so when that tree was alive, it's still taking in carbon-14.
Or oxygen, as I would, the
And
layman.
as soon as it dies, no more carbon-14. So all the carbon-14 that's in there starts to decay. So if you had a pound of it in there, these are huge numbers. The numbers are actually much smaller. But if you had a pound of it in there, after 5,280 years, you've got like half a pound. After another 5,280 years, now you're down to half of that, which is a quarter of a pound. After another 5,280 years, you got an eighth of a pound. And it keeps going down. So by the time you get up to 70,000 years ago, you're talking about 12 half-lives. And you've got a very minuscule amount left. It becomes almost impossible to measure it. And finally, it's all going to be gone. So that's the date, because you still have to be able to measure what's left.
So
in
it
there.
could be that there were humans around here 130,000 years ago.
Except we don't find any skeletons or anything.
And if you did, you wouldn't be able to carbon date it.
Couldn't carbon date them. There's other dating techniques that we might be able to use depending on what conditions are found in. But that between 70,000 years ago and about 200,000 years ago or so ago, it is hard to date things in that window because there aren't a lot of dating techniques that can work unless things are found in special circumstances. So.
Well, that's interesting. So, we always think that the Indians were here and that was pretty much it, but there may have been people here 100,000 years ago.
It's possible, but we haven't found any remains. And also we got the problem with the glaciers because for 2 million years, we had glaciers coming and going in North America. So this stuff gets wiped clean. For the last, the glaciers went away for the last time about 12,000 years ago.
What you mean a glacier, like all the way to here?
Oh, well, not to Tennessee, but down to southern Ohio. Mm-hmm. Covered basically everything from the Ohio River north in through Canada. It just wipes all that clean. It just pushes everything down. So even if there was stuff there before then, you probably couldn't find it.
If it washes it clean, does it just take part of it out in the ocean, or does it?
It pushes it down further south, and a lot of it gets washed away in the major river systems of the upper Midwest, like the Ohio, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, all these big river systems eventually erode all that stuff down. And so it gets totally out of context and displaced and
So
destroyed.
in time, they could come up with another method to date stuff, and they could come up with some evidence of something and date it and find out it's 200,000 years, or who knows, right?
They could. I mean, if you could invent a dating method that covers that gap in there between about 70,000 years ago and 200,000 years ago, you'd be rich. Just like Libby got rich off of carbon-14 dating. So,
boy, that's really something to think something would. Wonder how much erosion. Like say out here in the yard, if you didn't touch it for 70,000 years, it would have huge trees and how much
Yeah.
dirt on top of it.
Oh, that's part of what we study as archaeologists, is how did the landscape change over time? And a few years ago, I was out at the Whitewater Center. This is way before it burned down. I was out there meeting Quentin Bass and some other folks for work that we were doing with them. And I remember standing out in the parking lot, and I heard a bunch of tourists that were out there at the Whitewater Center saying, they're looking at the mountains around them, at the trees, and saying, it's just like when the Indians were here. And I'm thinking to myself, no, this is nothing like it was when the Native Americans were here. There's not a tree out there in the Ocoee River Valley that's over 80 years old. They're all cut down. By 1930, every tree that was out there in the National Forest, that we call them National Forest now, was cut to the ground. They were cut down to the stumps. Those are all new growth trees. And all the wildlife that was out there, totally destroyed. It's been slowly building back up. The white-tailed deer that are over in the National Forest are from Michigan. Because when they cut the forest down, all the white-tailed deer died. And so they had to go to Michigan and import white-tailed deer from Michigan. And the only reason the white-tailed deer survived in Michigan, because they cut all the forest down up there too, was we have big cornfields up there that the deer survived in. But those are all Yankee deer out there running around in the National Forest now, or descendants of Yankee
Well,
deer.
and even TVA changed the whole landscape of that. I reckon it was just a wide, kind of a marshy area.
Yeah, the TVA was kind of necessary because when you cut down all the forests and you kill all the beavers built dams up there in the mountains. And now you got to have human beavers build dams down here in the valley to prevent the flooding.
Yeah.
That's what the beavers did up there. So we look at these changing landscapes. So when I go up there, and I've been doing this survey for 8 years up on the North River, and this watershed that we work in, there used to be beaver dams up there at one point. We know that. When we go down and dig shovel test pits and stuff, we find pond sediments and stuff at the bottom of these things where this area had been dammed up before. Well, the only thing that would do that are beavers. And where the people lived 5,000 BC up there, we're on the edge of these beaver ponds. And that's where we find the camps. That's where we find the quarry sites. That's where we find all the stone tools that they're making. And so the environment was very different. And they had huge chestnut trees and hemlock trees. And they had huge walnut trees. And they could live off the land because there was a lot of food up there. Now, if you tried to live off the land up there, you just die because there's not enough biomass up there to do it. It's a shadow of what it used to be in terms of just the lushness of it was totally superior just 100 years ago before we cut all the forest down.
Not to mention 8,000 years ago.
Yeah, and 8,000 years ago, even more untouched by humans. It was a lush environment, not too hard to make a living off of. I mean, you get lots of food. And people migrated between the valley and the mountains seasonally to exploit the different food resources. We know that because we find Knox chert from the Tennessee Valley up in the mountains. You don't find Knox chert naturally in the mountains. You only find it down here in the Tennessee Valley.
Why would they take the chert up there?
They make stone tools with it. They make arrowheads and things with it. So they carry it up there. They actually take Knox chert stone tools up with them, but they also take nodules up to make more stone tools. So they're carrying this stuff up from the valley. And that's the kind of patterns that we study up there. And why bother? I know people say, well, who cares? I mean, I've had, some of my Christian mentors say, well, what does that matter? Go study the Bible. What does it matter? I'm like, but God knew these people were there. Even though it doesn't say anything about them in the Bible, and even though it doesn't seem important to us today, these people adapted to the land that God had placed them in, and they were ingenious in doing that. And I think there's a lot we can learn from how they adapted to the landscapes that they live in. I think we can learn to be better ourselves at adapting to the landscapes that we live in. I think what humans do this over and over again throughout history. We have to learn to adapt to changing conditions.
Do you think the human body adapts to be taller, shorter, or
sure,
heavier in cold weather and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I take you up here to these cemeteries, early 1800s cemeteries like the Cloud or Price Cemetery up there. These people were only like 5 foot. The males were like 5 foot 4 inches tall. Those are big males. Well, today, 5'10".
They say some of those old Western guys that were gunslingers were like 5'2" or something.
Yeah, they were pretty puny compared to, because we got better nutrition and we got better medical care. And so we're
probably
bigger.
Better health through the adolescent ages too that makes you grow.
Yeah, we don't have the hard work from an early age either that kind of damages your bones and stuff. So, I mean, we
Oh,
have
yeah,
our
yeah.
kids get an extended we had an extended childhood, right? We got to mess around.
There,
play.
they were lifting heavy objects and squishing their spine. And
Yeah, they're doing all this farm work and.
now, what about the giants of the land? Have you ever had any thoughts about that, or were they really here?
Well, there could have been very large people. I mean, you look at, if you go to South, I mean, if you take people who are a lot shorter than we are now, like even 100 years ago, you take these average male size, 5'4", 5'5", take them to South Africa and introduce them to tribes like the Watusi, that are, 7.5 foot tall people. They're going to seem like giants, right? So certainly there could have been some people in some places that were a lot bigger phenotypically than people who were
But
in other places.
not 20 foot tall and stuff.
Well, no, I don't think there were any 20. We've never found any skeletons or anything
Never found
like that.
any skeletons that
Yeah.
any larger than a 8 foot.
Yeah, I mean, we found, so they exist, we find 7 feet tall, maybe.
But no.
Yeah.
Because you see a lot of that on the internet. They've unearthed in a grave with some of that's just scams, I
Yeah,
guess.
part of it was, I know the old Cardiff Giant up in New York that was dug up years ago was actually a hoax that a guy had, to earn some money, had created. He commissioned this statue to be created, buried it on his farm, and left it there for a while, so to get a nice patina on it, and then went out and dug it up and said, look what I discovered, and charged money for people to see it.
That would be easily debunked, I guess.
Yeah, it took a while because people want to believe. I mean, I want to believe in Bigfoot, right?
Yeah, I sort of believe in Bigfoot.
I'm interested still.
I mean,
but we haven't found one yet.
Well, and I don't know if that matters. 30,000 years ago, there could have been animals here that we would never even dream of that have gone extinct.
Very possible. There were large animals here that we do have the remains of some of them, and there are probably other ones that we don't. I mean, there were 5 foot, believe it or not, there were 5 foot tall beavers that lived here. If you go back about 20,000 years ago. Standing
up like this, or just
sitting up on their, like beavers sit up.
Yeah.
They're almost 5 feet tall.
Good grief. And how long ago has that been?
We're talking, 20, 30,000 years ago. There's a, and even going back further, I mean, there were more of them. They probably survived up until then. A few of them survived through the Ice Age, but they were really plentiful almost a million years ago around here. Before humans ever got here. So there was all this megafauna that covered, I mean, this is mastodons, mammoths, and all that. Some of the mastodons survived up until about 10,000 years ago.
How big was a mastodon?
About half the size of a modern elephant, most of them, a little bit smaller than a modern elephant. Mammoths were bigger than modern elephants. And there were some mammoths here. Mammoths didn't survive quite as long, but mastodons did.
Where is it they found, one guy's found a big grave site for all the mastodons, or what's that guy's name? I can't think of his name.
I can't either. I just read a book not long ago on mammoths, and they were talking about mastodons too. There have been a few recent big discoveries. So
it's like they all went to a certain place to die, like the elephants do.
Yeah, and it probably has to do with their migratory patterns and stuff. They probably huddled up like during a certain time of the year when life was hard, and that's where a lot of them died. Yeah, that's what happens in Africa with the elephants.
What about when the Bible talks about he begat him and he begat him and he begat? If they can trace that back, can't they come up with some type of a time frame?
I've looked at I've done a lot of work with genealogies among families in Egypt and in Jordan. In fact, we did a big survey project in Jordan. There are 14 Christian tribes in Jordan, and there are a whole bunch of Muslim tribes too. But we were interested in the Christian villages and the Christian tribes. And what we find is that when we compare genealogies collected by the same families, like we have the Akasha tribe and the Hejazin tribe, both have genealogies of who they're descended from. But if you look at different people within the Akasha tribe or the Hejazin tribe, and you look at the individual family genealogies, they skip people. They're not consistent. And in fact, over time, what they do is they shorten the genealogies because they get too big. And so you just throw out the people who aren't important. And so you skip over, this grandpa wasn't important. He
But what
didn't do
about when the
anything.
Bible says begat?
Well,
The word begat
but
means what?
begat can also just indicate, for example, I'm begat of my great-great-grandfather. And you can skip all the people.
I thought it was my son.
No, you can skip all the people between. And we know that this happens in the genealogies. This is what, even if you look at biblical genealogies, you can see where one genealogy will leave a few people out.
So my great-grandfather begat me.
Yeah.
Even though if I was reading that, I would thought, well, that was his father.
And you can skip over the unimportant ones. In Semitic genealogies, they always skip over the unimportant
What's
ones.
Semitic mean?
Means these Middle Eastern peoples that speak Arabic, Hebrew, Syriac, Ugaritic. These are the Semitic languages. Yeah.
So now when the Muslims came in, like the Coptic Christians were here for a while, like 600 AD, and then they got the Muslims came in and sort of had their own religion, right?
Yeah.
And so they were reading which Bible? They weren't reading the King James because King James wasn't here, right?
That's true. They were reading the Orthodox, collected Orthodox scriptures of the time, mostly from the Byzantine church, not the Coptic church, because the Coptic church is over in Egypt. Muslims were over in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, which was controlled by the Byzantine Empire at the time Muhammad lived. And so they had monks, Byzantine monks down there near where Muhammad lived. Muhammad also traveled to Byzantium, Constantinople, is part of the caravan trade that he was involved in when he was young. And so he was familiar with Byzantine Christianity. He had met and known Byzantine Christian monks. And so their scriptures are the ones that he would have been familiar with. But Muhammad couldn't read or write. So they were hearing stories. He was hearing stories from other people who could read and write. One of Muhammad's cousins, Waraka, was a Christian and was very influential in saying that this man is the prophet of God. And certainly he probably taught Muhammad a lot about Christianity and the stories of Christianity. But these people also knew a lot about Judaism because they traveled throughout the Middle East and doing this caravan work. And lots of Jews went down to Mecca on these pilgrimages. And so Jews were trading throughout there. And so Judaism, Christianity, side by side there. Muhammad didn't like Jews or Christians. He looked at Judaism and saw how corrupt they were from his perspective. He said, your God, your God, Abraham taught you about your God, and you're not living up to what Abraham taught you. You people aren't what Abraham wanted. And so he looked at the Christians, and the Christians, of course, during that time that Muhammad lived, were fighting each other. I mean, the Coptic Christians, the Byzantine Christians were fighting each other, and of course, the Byzantines were very violent, conquering all the territory around them and everything. So he didn't care much for the Christians of the time. He didn't care much for the Jews of the time. And so, but he believed they were onto something. He believed that this God of Abraham, which is also the God of the Christians, had sent prophets, and people weren't listening to the prophets, and he decided he was a prophet. And basically built it. He took stuff from the Old Testament, he took stuff from the New Testament. He reinterpreted all of that. He also took a lot of stuff from pre-Islamic Saudi Arabia too, and all this becomes Islam. Islam, though, is there's two things. There's the Hadith. These are the witnesses, 2,000 people about who knew Muhammad when he was alive, that were called the companions. They wrote down what they saw Muhammad do, what they heard him say, that kind of stuff. These are called the companions, and their collected writings are called the Hadith, the sayings. And so this is what Muhammad taught, what he said, what he did, okay? And then there's the Quran. The Quran is a series of recitations by Muhammad, and people wrote them down because he couldn't read or write. So he says, basically, thus saith the Lord, and people wrote it down. You can't really understand the Quran without reading the Hadith. When I teach Arab world and Islam, we don't read the Quran. We read a little bit of the Quran, but you can't understand the Quran unless you read the Hadith, because the Hadith tells you what he's talking about in the Quran. you have no idea what he's talking about if you just read the Quran. Because the Quran is not written in order. There's no order to it. It's listed from longest surah to the shortest surah. Surahs are chapters. And he's speaking to a specific group of people in each one of those. But he doesn't tell you who he's speaking to because he's just speaking it to them. You have to go to the hadith and find out, oh, it was on this date he recited this to this group of people addressing this problem. Then you can understand it. But it's very different than the Bible, which the Bible, both in the Old Testament and New Testament, contextualizes a lot of things. It tells you who's talking to whom, kind of what the problem is. I mean, there's a bigger
and it really doesn't read like a book either.
No,
You know what I'm saying?
You still have to know some other contextual things to understand parts of the Bible too, sure.
So the Bible, we think that, now AD and BC, is that after death?
It's Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, is AD. So that means after the birth of Christ, in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini.
So if you're a Islam, you don't go by the calendar.
They do AH, Anno Hijra, because their calendar dates from the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, which happened in 623 AD. So year one of AH is 623 AD to us, but they have a lunar calendar.
Golly.
They have a lunar calendar, which is very different than our solar calendar, so you can't just subtract the years to make the two calendars go.
If I'm going to meet somebody in Pikeville, Tennessee, I always say Eastern time, because they might be on Central.
Right.
But if you were talking to somebody there, you'd have to say BC, AD, AH. You'd have to tell them which calendar you're using.
Well, yeah.
Do they have the same time as we do?
Yeah, I mean, the time is the same.
The time is the 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock.
All the newspapers in Jordan, Egypt, other Arab countries, but in Egypt in particular, there are always 3 calendar dates on the newspaper. There's the Coptic calendar date, which is not the same as our calendar. There's our calendar date, which is the Western calendar, and there's the Muslim calendar date. And they're at the masthead of the newspapers.
Boy, that would be complicated. I never knew that. Why do the Coptics have a different calendar?
They date their calendar from 284 AD. That's when the Emperor Diocletian rose to power in the Roman Empire, and he persecuted the Christians. So they date their calendar from the great persecution of the Emperor Diocletian, which begins with his reign. It didn't get bad until around 300 AD, but after he became king, things went really bad for the Christians. There was a great persecution.
You'd think us being Christians that came from the Coptic Christians that we would be adopting that calendar?
Well, it's important to them historically, which is why they did that, but that history is not part of our history because
us being the United States?
Well, we adopted everything from the Europeans, and at this time, I mean, we still had the Roman calendar up in Europe, and that's what we get over here. So the Coptic Christians never had much influence on the Western world, which is unfortunate because they had a lot to offer. But what happened after 451 AD was the Coptic Christians broke from communion with Rome and with Byzantium and said, you guys are a bunch of heretics. And they said, we have nothing more to do with you. They became their own church in AD 451. And so they've gone their separate way. And then, of course, later on, Roman Church split with the Byzantine Church. So the Byzantine Church became the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, persisted in Europe. And then the Protestant Reformation happens, and that's where we come from, eventually.
The Protestant Reformation, which happened in America, right?
Well, it happened in Europe with Luther and other people who split away from Roman Catholicism and founded Protestantism. And then lots of the Protestant groups persecuted in Europe fled to the United States, along with Catholics too. And those early Protestant groups set up.
Now, what about the Puritan movement?
That was a primitive, fundamentalist kind of Christian.
Was it
Protestant? They're part of that Protestant movement. Yeah.
What about the Amish?
Amish, similar kind of thing. Yeah, they're from Protestant movement. But they're primitive Christians. They believe they rejected all this modern society stuff. We need to live like, more.
But they still came out of the Protestants?
Yeah, they're still
Or
Protestants.
the Lutheran?
Yeah, well, not directly related to Lutherans. They were Germanic folks who were Protestants who moved to the United States.
Germanic means Germany.
Yeah, they were from Germany.
What about the Shakers?
Shakers were kind of homegrown American group. They were a group that sort of, I'm not sure I don't remember who they split off from, but they were part of a Christian group here. And of course, their thing was, we don't have sex. So, people joined.
Not any of them left.
People joined, and then at one point they decided we're not going to take any more members. And so, what's the end result of that? You don't have any more Shakers.
Bad plan.
Yeah. So, yeah, you didn't think ahead for that too much, but.
Now, all of these religious groups, so we've had not religious groups, but societies and civilizations and group thinking has been going along ever since recorded time, right?
Yeah, sure.
And they couldn't have had recorded time until they had a way to read and write and communicate.
You can keep time without reading and writing, but yeah, it's much easier when you can read and write.
So before they had writings, because having language is one thing, having writing of the language is probably a whole nother thing. Because me and you could talk. I mean, people that can't read or write can still communicate. So people were communicating. Wonder how that got together.
Well, the minute you write stuff down, as long as there's a community of people who can read what's written, I don't have to be there to say it again and again, right? And I think that's kind of how religious texts are, right? Once a religious text is written down, the Bible, God said it, but he doesn't have to appear and say it again. It's right there.
But before they had writings, they communicated through a language.
Yeah.
And how did the languages get all split up so much?
Well, when we look at historical linguistics, you can trace how languages, through geographic isolation, political isolation, change over time. I mean, even generationally, you can see how languages change.
Like the Fonz used to say, cool. What was it Fonz said?
A was a big one.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was okay.
Well, I say stuff in front of my classes that totally mystifies my students. Like,
so
I can say neat and cool and groovy with a straight face, and they can't.
They don't know what you're talking about.
Right. They don't, but they got slang and jargon too. That becomes part of, and a lot of their slang and jargon is tied up in social media.
Yeah.
Which I don't get.
LOL or something.
I slipped in somebody's DMs or something.
Yeah.
I'm like,
what's that mean?
And why do I care?
Yeah.
But they don't get my jargon either.
Yeah.
And so that jargon contributes to language change over time. So you can have social isolation even within a particular group. So you get development of jargons and things like that. Social classes develop different ways of talking. And certainly people who are geographically isolated from each other develop different languages over time. I mean, Australian English is not American English. It's not British English. And in India, Indians speak English as their official national language, but Indian English is nothing like American English or Australian English or American English. We speak very distinctly different languages. When I went to Australia, when I was in the Navy, this was back in '76, I guess it was, I went to Perth. And I remember getting off, it was weird. We were on an aircraft carrier, I was on the USS Enterprise. We had to anchor out. They used landing craft, these old World War II landing craft, to take us into the beach, because Perth at that time was like the Wild West in the 1970s. It was mostly miners that lived out there and stuff, and they come riding into town on Fridays with their guns shooting in the air. But we decided to stop this diplomatic thing that we were on. We stopped there. And I remember all these Perth families were waiting there to grab us as we came off these landing crafts. So we came up to the beach like on D-Day or something. They dropped these landing things. We walked up, and we felt like we were hitting the beaches at D-Day or something. All these families were standing there ready to grab us, and these people were grabbing us and say, "Hey, mate, want to meet some Sheilas?" And I'm like, "What? What are you talking about? Sheilas?" And I'm like, "Girls, you want to meet some girls?" And I'm like, "Okay." But that kind of talk, and it was just fascinating. That was my real first encounter with an English that was totally different than our English. And These guys were great, but they were always fascinated with our linguistic differences. Remember, this is the 70s, so there wasn't all the
Yeah.
social media and interconnectedness that we have
Yeah.
now. So they thought we talked weird. We thought they talked weird. I really got interested in linguistics because of that. And then in the Philippines, the Filipinos and Filipinas there spoke a version of English that was very different than American English. It took some getting used to. They also spoke Spanish and they spoke Tagalog. So they were trilingual, and we Americans were all monolinguals, but they were speaking a dialect of English that we didn't speak. And it got me to thinking about language diversification and things like that. And I've written some articles on language difference and things like that, and how languages change over time. But a lot of other people have done better work than I have on that. But it's inevitable that if you isolate groups from each other, the languages will diversify from each other, even if they start with the same
Especially over
language.
time.
Yeah. Yeah, over time. I mean, if you look at early modern, look at Old English, just 500 AD, the English that was spoken sounded, the Lord's Prayer. Ora Vater die art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. We don't talk like that anymore. That was English 1,500 years ago.
See, to me, you don't even sound like you're speaking English.
Yeah. But that's English.
That's Queen's
Our
English.
Father who art in heaven. Ora Vater die art in heaven. That's our Father who art in heaven. And they got a lot of words in there, like gay dad vanlichen, which we don't have in modern English. So just in 1,500 years, English went from that to what we have now. And so languages do change fairly quickly. And people say, well, because of social media, it's not going to change as fast. I don't believe that. I think language is going to change just as fast.
Do you think that we'll all, through social media, because I can talk to somebody and text somebody in Russia or Ukraine or wherever, maybe the languages will eventually become the same, but you're saying then you got the social context that changes it, not only geographic.
Yeah, it's because language is not just communication. It's part of people's identities. And so, for example, it would benefit every child in Bradley County if they would learn Arabic in elementary school. And if they became fluent, they'd make crunches of money when they graduated, okay? What if I wanted to start a program to teach all the kids in Bradley County Arabic?
There would be nobody there.
There'd be nobody there, and they'd be looking to kill me, right? They'd be looking to hunt me down.
Yeah.
Because there's a social stigma against it, even though it would be to the benefit of every American to know Arabic.
And most people don't even know what Arabic means.
Yep.
Or where, yeah, you're right. That would be a social stigma.
Most Americans we speak English. You want to be here, speak English. But when I went and lived in Egypt, I saw the other side of this. When I was in Egypt, they expected me to speak Arabic. I was in their turf.
Yeah.
And so I learned Arabic. And I internalized a lot of what it means to be an Arab because of that. Now, I'm not an Arab, but I understand Arabs better, especially Egyptian Arabs, because I internalized a lot of the language.
On the courthouse square at 30 2nd Street is the law firm of Logan Thompson Law. Since 1965, they have served the legal needs for the good citizens of Cleveland-Bradley County. If you've got a problem, they're no problem. Give them a call.
I specialize a lot in anthropology and looking at kinship relations and kinship studies. And so I've always been interested in how people affiliate through their relations to other people. And what I see, for example, in the Arab world, you have this tribal system where people are heavily intermarried with each other, and you have very large families. When I used to teach at Wayne State University, I always had about half of my class were kids from Dearborn. Most of them were Arabs. The other half were white people like me. And I always did this in my cultural anthropology class. I always did this assignment where I said, okay, I want to get a piece of paper out. I want all of you to write down the names of all of your relatives. And I said, you got to know the first name and the last name. I said, otherwise you can't write it down. You need the name, first name, last name of all your relatives. Well, white people could write about 60 or 70 names. Okay, that was good. A lot of white people could only write about 30 or 40.
Yeah.
my Arab students, I'd tell them stop. They could easily write 700, 800, 900 names because that's how many people they know. That's how many people they know are related to them in their families. And they see these people all the time. They have huge get-together. They make social visiting was a big thing in Egypt. When I made friends with Egyptians, I got dragged along to all these. We got to go see this person. We got to see this person. We got to see this person. They spent a huge amount of their time during the week just visiting relatives. They had to touch base regularly with all these people, and it was hundreds of people. And I had one of my Arabic teachers, and his name was Mohammed Bakri, and he was a nice guy, but he would always come into our Arabic class, and he would be bemoaning the fact that he married a woman who wasn't his first cousin. And we got to talking about that because that's what we try to figure out in anthropology. And well, it turns out what happens is if you marry a woman who is your first cousin, she's in your family. Her family's the same as your family. Okay. That means gift-giving obligations and stuff at holidays and things like that don't change. And also your visitation doesn't increase. But if you marry a woman who is not your first cousin, her family is not your family. Now you got two families.
2 Thanksgiving dinners.
Exactly. You've doubled all of your social obligations. And so the way they knit their kinship structure together is very different than us, where we basically, in this country, we've minimized our familial relations. We have very little obligation to anybody except for wives and children, maybe grandkids.
Maybe grandmother, maybe grandfather.
But
you get much past the first, you get into first cousins, you may not even socialize with them.
That's true. We've diminished those relations. And part of it has to do with the way we have to make a living here. In the Middle East, wherever you're born, you're probably going to grow up and live and die there, okay, for most people. In the United States, that's not true. I mean, I was born in Michigan. I lived in West Virginia for a couple of years because my dad was from there. My dad was born in West Virginia but died in Michigan. Then I moved to Tennessee. I've been here in Tennessee for over 25 years. So we're like nomads. We have to move around and look for work. And we can't carry all those kin obligations with us like the Arab folks do who live in the same village from birth to death.
And our work is a little different. We're more of a working society. We're, 5 days a week and get ready on Sundays. And
yeah, the economics are very different here.
Unless you go to church with them, you're probably not, or work with them, you're probably not going to see them. And I don't know if that's bad, but that's the way it is. Yeah,
it's different. It can be good, it can be bad. There's good and bad about all these systems. Like if you live in the Arab world, it sounds like, well, this sounds like great. You get all this family. It is great. But on the other hand, it can be oppressive too. People are always in your business. There's always somebody watching you, which is good because crime is very low in Cairo, a city of 20 million people. I could walk downtown in Cairo at midnight. Nobody can bother me. It was great because everybody's watching everybody. I wouldn't walk downtown midnight in Chattanooga. I don't care how many guns I carried with me, right? I'm just not going to do that. Most American cities, that's true. I'm not going to walk alone in those because everybody's not watching everybody. Everybody's doing their own thing. But in the Arab world, it's very different. Every time I went into a new village or even a new neighborhood in Cairo, people come out of their house and stop me and say, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" Well, I got guys walking down my road in the middle of the night, and I say, "Hey, how you doing?" And they flip me the bird. Everybody knows everybody's business, and you don't say, "Leave me alone" in Cairo, because they'll call the police and say they're going to find out who you are and what you're doing there. And if you're there and you're not hurting anybody, they're fine with that. But you got to be social about it. It's a very different world. I want to go back to and make sure people don't misunderstand me, especially about this stuff about creation and stuff. When I came to anthropology, I was minister first. I was Christian first, minister. And one of the things I realized philosophically is that you got to make a choice before whatever you do in life. Everybody's got to make a choice here. You either got to believe there is a God or there isn't a God. There's no in between. Either there is a God who created the universe and everything that follows from that, okay, or there isn't, okay? The earth somehow created itself and all this other stuff, okay? Well, you got to pick and choose. You pick one. You can't pick both, okay?
It's impossible to pick both.
This is a basic a foundational assumption that philosophers have realized you got to make. Well, I choose to believe there's a God. And then I see a lot of evidence for that. The other perspective is if there isn't a God, I don't see the evidence for that because, in other words, what we started this conversation off with when I talked about these kind of universal moral imperatives that are built into us, why don't I find human societies that just don't have any moral cares, that just do whatever they want? All human societies are basically operating the same way. They build this social order around kinship relationships, and some of them build particular kinds of political relations beyond that. But there's always this assumption that I got to play fair, and if I don't play fair, if I have to deviate from that, I got to justify it. And there seems to be this morality that's built into us. Well, where does that come from? In a Darwinian universe with no God over here on this hand, that shouldn't exist. It should not exist. But it does exist. So where does it come from? Well, it comes from the Creator who put that into us. Okay, then my job becomes, okay, how do I understand God's working in the world? What do I need to understand about God's working in the world? And I've looked at all the possibilities, and to my satisfaction, Christianity seems to answer most of the questions. That I've looked at other religions, Buddhism and Hinduism, and Islam is really derivative of Judaism and Christianity. So they're earlier versions, but Christianity seems to fit the bill, and there's personal experiences that have verified that with me. And so I become a Christian who does anthropology, and I think in doing anthropology, I understand the world a little bit more like how God understands the world, not how I, in a very parochial, kind of restricted cultural view of my own, see the world. Because we can see the world and never see outside of our own cultural biases. Or we can make the effort and we can jump up and go, there's a bigger framework here. God's not an American. He's not a Russian. He's not a British. How does God see the world? Well, God sees the world as human beings that he created biologically. So there's a biological aspect, genetic aspect. God sees us. He created us in the past. We have a history. That's all archaeology and paleoanthropology. He gave us language to communicate. Language is such an important part of culture. You can't have culture without language, really, and you can't have language without culture. The two are intimately interconnected. So understanding language really tells us something about human thinking, human thought, how we organize reality, understand reality, all that kind of stuff. But God doesn't just speak English or German or French. Thank God he doesn't speak French, but only. But God knows French. God knows all this. God is not restricted by one particular cultural perspective. So as an anthropologist, the goal is to understand that bigger perspective. How does God see the world? That's how I see anthropology. How does God see the world? He sees it from a much bigger perspective. Now, I will never understand the world like God does because I'll never be God. But I think seeing a bigger picture helps me understand and overlook some things that divide us so badly. For example, how many times in church services have I heard one denomination speak against another denomination? And I'm like,
Every Sunday nearly.
yeah, and I'm like, they're Christians, folks. Go over there and talk to them. We had a missionary come back from Russia a number of years ago into our church, and he was a former student of mine. And he got up in front of the church and making his missionary pitch for money, which I support missionaries, and I'm all for missions. But he said he started his testimony with, you pray for us because the devil's really after us. The Russian Orthodox Church just won't leave us alone. And I'm like, you just called the Russian Orthodox Church the devil. I talked to him afterwards about this, and I said, don't do that. Mm-hmm. I said, the reason the Russian Orthodox Church is angry at you is because you don't talk to them. You're taking their people, and you're bringing them to your movement. Why don't you talk to the priests? Why don't you? And I spent a lot of time in the countries. I go to South America, spent a lot of time in Chile, talked to a lot of Catholic priests down there because there's a lot of animosity between the evangelicals in Chile and the Catholic folks in Chile. Well, if they would just talk to each other, the differences aren't as great as they think. And there could be a lot more cooperation. But I see it here in America, too, where even denominations locally don't want to cooperate with each other because they see the divide is great. But God sees a bigger picture where he goes, you folks aren't as different as you think you are. But you build these walls, which aren't important. And so becoming an anthropologist, I wanted to see that perspective. I wanted to be able to grasp that so that I could bring people together rather than just have us all build our walls and separate from each other.
So you think people are more alike? You think humans are more alike, and our religion and our beliefs are more alike than we believe?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, even the different religions, they're still worshiping a creator, right?
Yeah.
Humans have seemed to have always wanted to worship a creator. Even evidence of Indians before we say they were separated, but maybe they weren't. But the Indians worshiped the sun, right?
Well, the Native Americans here in North America, most of them believed in some supreme deity. They had a hard time, putting a specific name on that and stuff. But I mean, yeah, they believed in that. And you have to here's the thing, and the thing that's bothered me for years too, is I heard someone say once years ago, well, all those Native Americans have to be in hell because they never heard about Jesus. And I'm like, wait a minute. These people didn't know anything about Jesus, okay? Is God really not that merciful? I mean, let's leave that judgment to God. My own personal feeling on that is God will judge them according to what they knew. And they didn't know a whole lot, okay? Certainly they didn't know about this revelation we have in Jesus Christ. How could they be held accountable for that?
It's always confused me too.
Yeah. And so I just don't see a real problem with that. And the Bible doesn't give us a lot of guidance on how to read that. But here's another thing. We Western people want answers for everything.
Definite answers.
The minute you ask a question like, where are the Native Americans? Well, you got to have a definite answer. They're all in hell. Okay? Well, no, how do you know that? You can't possibly know that. Only God knows that.
I guess they didn't know anything. So, of course, the Methodist Church came through here and tried to do a lot of converting.
I'm okay with mystery. One of the things I learned from the Coptic Orthodox Christians is there are a lot of questions you can't answer. There are a lot of questions you don't have to answer. It's a mystery.
Yeah, and I would hate to sit down and judge somebody else's soul based on the way I read it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I don't want to be in that position of judging them. Let God judge them.
Wonder how far our cognitive biases really twist what we're thinking.
Oh, they do to a great degree, and I'm not sure that we ever totally overcome them because when we're born into a culture, we internalize that. And
I don't know if I don't know if you can detect your own cognitive biases because we've been so ingrained to a tradition or a belief or a thinking.
yeah, the only way I think you can do that, and the reason I came to Lee was because I was asked to help develop what they call the Global Perspective Program. And I'm convinced the only way you can discover your own biases is to go and understand how somebody else thinks. Then you got something to compare it to. Otherwise, you only know what's in your head.
Otherwise, I'm just comparing me and my wife and my kids.
And we all
my
share the
mother.
same stuff in our heads.
We've got all the
But
same
I go to
biases.
Egypt and I learn a different language that I have to use every day. And I find out how these Egyptians live, what they think, what they know. Well, I find out they don't know the same stuff I know. They think differently than I do, and their language is very different. And I begin to understand how they understand their place in the world. Then I can reflect on my place in the world. How do I understand my place in the world? What's true in all of this? You can't know what's just and good and pure and all that stuff unless you have something to compare it to. At the end of World War II, Montgomery was in charge of Germany during the occupation. He had a problem. He had about 30 or 40,000 of these Nazi youth that had been indoctrinated into the worst form of Nazism, thought that every other culture, every other language-speaking group in the world was the devil, okay? What do you do with these kids? They're kids. Mm-hmm. They're all under like 18, these Nazi youth.
They've been trained in one way, right?
I didn't think of much of him as a general, but as an occupier in Germany, man was brilliant. His solution was because what happened after the war ended was all these British soldiers particularly, and a lot of the American soldiers too, who occupied Germany, brought their wives over to stay with them and their families, okay, during the occupation. And Montgomery, genius, he said, take these kids and give them to these families, one at a time. Let them spend time with British families. Let them spend time with American families. Let them see a different culture. And when these Nazi youth were exposed to another culture, they found out, man, I was really messed up. They're not like that we were taught at all. These people are different. And they changed their way of thinking. And most of those Nazi youth, there were some exceptions, but most of those Nazi youth were rehabilitated back into society. They gave up all this extreme radicalism that had dominated their upbringing and their indoctrination. That's why when I was brought to Lee in 1998 to develop this program in Global Perspectives, was we designed the program, Merle Dirksen and I, to force the students to go abroad and learn about somebody else, to interact with them, get in their head, listen to what they say, learn to know what they know, so they have something to compare their own cultural experience to, which we think makes them better. And the history of the program is it does make them better when they do that. If you just go abroad as a tourist, it doesn't change you a bit, and I could show you tons of literature that proves that.
Well, that's the truth, isn't it?
But if you go and you meet people and you spend time with people and talk to people and listen to people, it changes you.
We're not talking about going to Italy and eating a nice dinner and learning the culture. You're talking about staying in a zip code for a while.
Yes, and sitting down and saying, what's your life like here? Tell me about your life. Tell me what you think about the world you live in. Where do you go to church? What do you believe? Mm-hmm. What do you know? How about your family? Tell me about your family. When you find out people don't think about family the same way as you think about family. Or even like in Egypt, I had all these conversations with people, like we talked about freedom. There's an Arabic word, hurriya, which means freedom. In fact, there's a newspaper in Egypt called Hurriya, freedom. And Egyptians talk about freedom all the time. Well, we talk about freedom here all the time, too. But I sat down actually with a bunch of old men, a lot of them old Army veterans from the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, that I used to go to these coffee shops in Egypt. I sit down and talk with these old guys, and I'd say, when we talk about freedom, what do you mean by freedom? Their idea of freedom is totally different than ours.
Is it more, how is their thinking different?
We believe when we say freedom, I'm free, we believe I can do what I want without boundaries. Mm-hmm. Freedom only comes with boundaries. Freedom is not just freedom for me, but it's freedom from you. There have to be boundaries to protect me from you. So, in fact, the Egyptians would argue, either whether Christian or Muslim would say, and a lot of these are religious boundaries. There's stuff you just don't do. You can be free, but there's stuff you just don't do. In America, it's like, no, let's do everything. In fact, what we see constantly in America is a breaking of the boundaries. We don't want boundaries. Drugs, let's have all legalized drugs. We know drugs are bad for people.
But isn't it people's choice to be free to take drugs if they want?
In our culture, yeah. In Arab culture, it's no, because you're taking drugs impacts me. You have no business. You're not free to do things that impact me negatively, because you become a burden to me.
A burden to society, a burden to your family, etc.
And so their idea of freedom is totally different than our idea, even though
it's still freedom.
It's freedom with boundaries.
Some would argue that it's maybe more freedom, because as long as you're staying within these boundaries, I can be. I don't know. That's a very different take, isn't it? I hadn't thought about that as a different.
But here we have this escalating rejection of all norms and traditions and boundaries because it's progress.
Yeah.
But where does that lead? Nobody thinks about where does it lead.
And we don't know. We hadn't got there yet, right?
Yeah, and I think it leads to chaos and it leads to revolution. I hope not, but that's my own take on it. In the Middle East, people understand the social boundaries that are there. And there are some things about life there that are a lot safer than life here. Yeah, you have Egypt occasionally, the government, has problems and things like that, and there are coups and things like that happen there. But a lot of stuff never affects ordinary people. The government changes hands, but their life just keeps going on like it did before.
Because they don't move boundaries, maybe?
Yeah, because those boundaries among the ordinary folks are pretty rigid, if an outsider can come in and disrupt all that, but internally, a lot more stable in some ways than our culture is, even though, of course, there are abuses by power in Egypt, just like there are abuses in power everywhere. But I enjoyed my time with ordinary Egyptians, learned a lot about them, this kind of security and stability of family life and stuff exists in a way that doesn't exist for a lot of Americans.
We would think here that South is the best family-oriented, et cetera, but you're saying maybe theirs is even better.
Well, but you can't just take what they do and say, we're going to do this, because our culture context is totally different. This is what happened with Margaret Mead when she went to Samoa back in the 1920s and studied child-rearing practices in Samoa. She's a famous anthropologist, and she influenced tons of psychologists, including, your most recent guest here. And at least there's a legacy of her teachings that have infiltrated psychology. And one of the things that came out of her time there was she argued for permissive child raising. She said in Samoa, people don't punish their children. People kind of let them do whatever they want. They let them explore sexually, and they let them, do whatever they want. And this idea, Benjamin Spock and other people picked up on this idea and said, well, maybe we ought to adopt permissive child raising. Not punish our kids and just, not set these boundaries. Let them explore, let them be creative and stuff. Benjamin Spock, by the way, apologized before he died about what he unleashed on America with that.
Didn't they ban some of his books?
Yeah. I'm not saying they should have, but yeah, it was just bad thinking, because Samoa is not America. 1920s Samoa, what's the worst thing that could happen to a kid in 1920s Samoa in the South Pacific? Very few motor vehicles. And every villager is watching every kid as they're running around, so they're going to keep them safe, right?
Yeah.
That ain't America, okay? America, we got streets with cars. We got all kinds of stuff that we have to protect children from. We got lots of sexual predators. We got tons of stuff. Kids have to have boundaries on them, and they have to be restricted and protected in ways that didn't exist in Samoa. And what do kids in Samoa grow up to be? Well, they grow up to be horticulturalists and fishermen, okay? What do kids in America? Kids in America have to have discipline, because they have to go through a school system to be able to earn their education, to get a good job, to fit into an economy that's complex. America is not Samoa. So you can't take permissive child rearing practices. It work fine in Samoa.
Maybe it was the right thing there, but not the right thing
But not here. You can't just say, okay, let's take the permissive part and put it here. Well, no, you can, if you want to do that, let's just be horticulturalists and fishermen, okay? But we can't do that either. So we're kind of stuck with what we got. And this has been the error that a lot of non-anthropologists take the work of anthropologists and borrow it into their disciplines like psychology without understanding there's a bigger context in which this thing works. And so although we can learn a lot from what went on in Samoa, we have to be careful what we borrow and think is the answer to our problems, because it doesn't work that way. Everything is contextualized within a culture. Everything affects everything else.
What might work also in your family versus my family may be totally different too.
That's exactly true.
So maybe this person may raise his kids this way and this one raises them that way. You can't really say maybe which one's right or wrong, because it's just you don't know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, and what she was really studying down there was why Samoan kids just seem to gracefully become adults without any kind of adolescent crazy period.
And I would say it's a small community with people watching.
That's exactly it.
Time.
That's exactly it.
Did she not think of that?
Well, she knew that, but her work was borrowed by other people who didn't understand.
Oh, I see. Like Spock.
Yeah, she gave the context for all of that, but then people just said, well, they just took that part as permissive child rearing. Let's try that. And
that wouldn't work. It
doesn't really work here, because what you have is if you get kids who go into the educational system who aren't disciplined, you destroy the educational system. And we're kind of seeing that beginning right now, where you can't tell anybody what to do. You can't put boundaries on anybody. And so I think it's going to get worse, unfortunately.
Why do humans always want to have a God to worship, or or have a dogma, or have a ritual? Why are they ritualistic? Or is it because humans deep down are scared?
Well, I think that's part of the human condition. Is there's the unknown, right?
I mean, we're all scared to death, aren't we?
It's what am I here for? What is my value? Why do I exist?
And when I die, what's going to happen?
What's going to happen, exactly. Is this all there is? If this is all there is, it's a real dilemma. If this is all there is, then that's the Darwinian universe, right?
Yeah.
Nothing matters. I mean, I read all that, literature from the nihilists and stuff, where, you might as well just go out and kill yourself kind of thing. Well, I don't think that. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian dissident and Christian, he said that nihilism is not the proper response to despair. He said, of course there's despair in the world. He said, but it's not that, but there's no value in rejecting God just because there's despair in the world. In fact, he says the opposite is true. You need to embrace God to deal with the despair. Because if there's no meaning, that's not a good place to be. 'Cause if there's no meaning, there's no reason to live. But if there is a God, there is meaning. My life matters. Your life matters. What we do matters. And it matters not just for now, but for eternity. It puts a whole different take on existence.
People that believe in God seem to have an inner peace.
Yeah. Because you don't fear, you know what your purpose is, right? My purpose is to find a way to please God and to serve other people. And they find fulfillment in that. But if there is no purpose, if there is no reason, and basically you just wind up in a kind of self-serving hedonism, there's no peace in that. It just doesn't end. And I think we see that a lot now. We see the rise in all the various neuroses and problems that young people are having right now. There's this real, Emil Durkheim, the sociologist, the French sociologist who wrote about this in Le Suicide, when he wrote a book about suicide. Why did suicides increase radically in France in the 1800s? And it had to do with the same kind of thing we're going through here now. People lost meaning in their lives, and suicide rate went up because people just didn't see anything beyond themselves. And that's exactly what we're seeing now.
What stopped that in France?
Well, the wars, unfortunately, the wars brought new meaning to people's lives and war has a tendency for people to face their mortality and to think about things like death.
As people face their mortality, they become more of a believer in the aftermath, no matter what it is, right?
I think so.
They try to. Do you give any? You heard of simulation theory? You studied any of it?
Like in the Matrix kind of thing?
Yeah, that maybe we're just all in a simulation, and the simulation people they're not discrediting the God theory that's in there, but that maybe we are in a computer simulation that's playing over and over.
Yeah, I've read. In fact, I contributed to a book called "Jacking into the Matrix" franchise a number of years ago. Matthew Capel was a fellow grad student. We wrote a book, still in publication. I wrote an article in there about revitalization and how basically how people form moral communities. And a moral community is a kind of simulation. And of course, we were playing against all this, the Matrix kind of stuff, that we used to form up until probably beginning in the 1950s or so. Most of our moral community was in the United States anyway, was centered around a body of literature at which the Bible was pretty much the center, okay? Because even other literatures referenced the Bible, okay? Like Moby Dick was seen as, a take on, in fact, the Bible's quoted Moby Dick and things like that. So lots of literature connected to the Bible. The Bible was quoted a lot. The Bible was part of our everyday lives. When people had a moral question to deal with, they would quote the Bible. The Bible was quoted all the time.
So on every coffee table.
Yeah, and not everybody did that, but it was enough a big part of the culture that everybody knew what everybody was talking about. Even if you didn't buy into it, you knew what people were talking about.
Yeah.
Well, something shifted beginning in the 1950s. That's what I wrote about in my paper, was that we had a new simulation, and culture's like a simulation. In fact, in The Matrix, remember they say when Neo says, well, what is the Matrix? And Morpheus says, it's the world pulled over your eyes. Well, culture is the world pulled over your eyes,
Sure,
right?
sure.
And so what happened was, now our moral community is not defined by absolutes like found in the Bible or other religious texts. It's more defined by the mass media that we participate in, beginning with movies. When we go to a movie theater, we want heroes, but we don't have heroes like Abraham. We don't have heroes like David. We don't have heroes like Jesus.
Got Jason Bourne.
Yeah, we got Jason Bourne, which is a very mythic kind of hero. Or we got, like in the Matrix films, we got Neo, who's a kind of Christ, right? But he's not Christ, but he's a kind of Christ. We've got Morpheus, who's another kind of, mythic hero. And we got a character named Trinity, who's a kind of a mythic hero. We got these mythic heroes, okay? So we got our heroes, but they're generic kind of heroes. They got generic kind of morals, too. They won't say, they won't have any kind of specific morality like don't do drugs or anything like that. They will have this very generic morality. We should do good, right? That kind of thing. So you got these very generic good and evil characters that become our heroes. And for the 2 hours that we all sit in there and watch that movie, Emil Durkheim wrote about moral communities, and he put the moral community as the church for most of the history of the Western world. But now the moral community, everybody doesn't share the same church morality and understanding anymore. Now we share this understanding of a pop culture community as seen through film and now through online stuff and all that. That's our moral community. That's what we reference now when we talk about right and wrong. That's what we reference when we talk about how to understand good and evil. We don't talk about Bible stuff anymore. We don't talk about church stuff anymore. We talk about this pop media, pop culture kind of stuff. Pop culture has supplanted. It's the new simulation that's taken over from an area that the church used to have control over.
When did the church have that?
I think up until probably the 60s, 70s.
But before that, it was when?
When
it started?
I think it started when Christianity took over in Europe. I mean,
So it's been that long.
Yeah.
It's had a long run, hasn't it?
Yeah, because everybody referenced the church and the Bible and Christianity. I mean, that was the context within which everything. I mean, even our government, when it was formed, the United States government, was formed with references to
even our dollar,
Christian understanding and stuff. Yeah.
Now, but so you're saying since about 400 A.D., that's been the the moral compass that's this whole time.
Yeah, for a huge part of the world, yeah.
And now it's really not.
No, it's pop culture now. It's this mass media, pop culture. That's what's guiding people's thoughts. I'm kind of horrified when I go in the classroom now and start asking people about the Bible. Nobody knows about the Bible anymore.
And we're probably affected by that ourselves.
I don't know the Bible as well as I should, because in recent years, probably the last decade and a half of my life, I've been spending more time dealing with mass media stuff than I have with actually just spending time studying the Bible more.
And if you was to wonder something about the Bible, you'd go to Google, not the Bible.
Yeah. And then what are you getting? You're getting somebody's take on what the Bible says.
Or right? The 22 different, what do you call it, translations. Yeah. I didn't know there were so many translations.
Oh, yeah, there's a huge number.
Like 30?
It's essentially knowing and knowing about. A lot of people know about the Bible, but they don't know the Bible. I had one of my professors, Haitian, his name was Garan Montalus, great guy. He's passed away a few months ago. When I was working my dissertation and I was talking about all these books that I read, he said, it's good to read all those books. He said, but you should know a few good books well. That's stuck with me ever since. And I said, yeah, there's some merit to knowing a lot of stuff. But there's a few things you should know really well. And not just know about them, but know them. And I've tried to remember that when I do things. Pick out the most important things and pay attention to those deeply. And that's a culture too. When you look at a different culture, you can know. I could write a book about Arabs give it to people and say, here's Arab culture. Okay, now you know, if you read it, you know about Arab culture, but you don't know Arab culture
No.
because you haven't experienced it. There's a big difference between experiencing it and just knowing about it. We talk about that in religion all the time,
But
too.
experience it, you don't mean go there for 4 days and as a
Or
tourist.
just know Arabs and talk to Arabs. Then you can know something about Arab culture by talking to Arabs. What's in their head? That's where culture is. It's
Only
in here.
to compare.
Yeah,
only
to
kind of compare thinking.
Yeah, they say that anthropologists are people who go somewhere and live, and we learn enough to know that we'll never be one of them, but we're never happy with who we are. That's kind of true. I went to Egypt. I learned about Egyptians. I learned about that culture. I'll never be an Arab. I know that. But I know a lot of things about Arabs. But I come back here, and it creates a dissatisfaction with me in things I see in my own, because things I didn't see before bother me now. And I'm like, we really could be better about some of these things. On the other hand, there are a lot of things about Arab culture that are negative that I wouldn't want to transport to American culture. It goes both ways. And I understand why they don't like a lot of things about our culture, because they see us as very morally loose, and in many ways they're absolutely right. But I learned enough to know that God's bigger than both those cultures. And that my faith is not based in my culture. My faith is based in what I know and understand about how God understands the world. I think that's where anthropology has led me.
If we think that humans have been here for 7,000 years, then Jesus Christ coming is right here at the very end of it.
Yeah.
So prior to that, were they just word of mouth talking about God?
Yeah, well, look at all the people before Abraham. I mean, we got some stories in the Bible about people
Abraham
before
was about what year?
Abraham, about 2000 BC. So it's about 4,000 years ago.
So in theory, 66,000 years prior to that, there were people walking around.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and we know there were anatomically modern humans around 1 million years ago in Africa and Asia. We find their skeletons. I mean, what do we say about them? I mean, they're people. Philip Tobias,
But now you're saying 1 million. How do we know they were here 1 million years ago?
well, we have other ways. After about 500,000 years ago, we have potassium argon dating, which we can date things. And so all that work that was done in Africa along the Great Rift Valley, most of that's been very accurately dated. And we know that. Basically, modern humans like us have been around for a long time.
Are we Homo sapiens?
Yeah, Homo sapiens.
What
Now,
about-
there are a lot of names that are given to these other creatures, like
Yeah.
Neanderthal, but technically it's Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. It's just a variety of Homo sapiens. And now that we got the genetics of Neanderthals.
What about the Homo erectus?
Homo erectus, contemporary with early Neanderthals, and going back to over 1 million years ago, they were just like existed within the range of modern human variation. I remember Philip Tobias, who's a very famous paleoanthropologist from South Africa. He came to, and not particularly a Christian, by the way, but he came to give us a talk in grad school, and he was showing us these skulls. He had slides, and we're all grad students, and we're all up on this stuff, and he's going, tell me what this skull is, and we're like, Neanderthal. And he go to the next one, Neanderthal. And then he go to a bunch of other ones. We go Homo erectus, Homo erectus. And then he got through after doing us about 80 slides, okay? He said, all of these skulls came out of a 14th century Norwegian cemetery. And he said, it shows that the range of modern human variation encompasses all these earlier skeletons that we found. He said, these skeletons that we know are older than the 14th century look like these ones in the Norwegian cemetery. He said, basically, from like 1 million years ago or so, we're just talking one species. We got humans, we got Homo sapiens, we put a lot of different names on it, but we're just talking the same people.
You don't think there's a differences in them?
No, I don't think it's not significant. I mean, I do this bones and stuff, thing in my, I'll be teaching biological anthropology in the fall and talk about this stuff. And the bottom line is, whatever happened, here's how I start this class, whatever happened, God did it, okay? The past is mysterious, it's deep, It's fascinating. We find all this stuff. What does it mean? Most of the time we don't know. God did it. If I take that foundational assumption that there is a God, whatever has happened, God did it. I'm a committed theist. Just because we don't understand it, and just because I can't fit this thing over here to that thing over there because my understanding, I don't have a big enough picture to understand it, that doesn't negate Scripture. It doesn't negate the finding. It just means I'm ignorant. I can't connect them together. I don't know enough to connect them together because whatever happened in this world, if I'm a theist, and I am, God had to do it. So whether the earth is old or young, God did it.
And whether we find it in writing because they didn't write up until 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, and the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot of stuff. I mean, the Bible doesn't tell you how to fix your car. The Bible doesn't tell you about cars. The Bible doesn't tell you how to run a business, not the kind of businesses we have today. I mean, Proverbs is a good guide for some basic moral principles to follow, but
It doesn't tell you how to cook pinto beans, does it?
no, it didn't. All the stuff I had to know to operate a nuclear power plant, you can't find any of that in the Bible, right?
Not in there.
So, but it's valid knowledge. It's part of God's universe. It's what God created.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of this prehistoric stuff. I don't know. And I tell my class, I say every 2 years, all of this, your textbook, this textbook we have on early humans is going to be completely rewritten. And it is rewritten every 2 years because all the stuff I learned in the 80s when I was in school, totally different now. I said, they're going to find more skeletons, they're going to find more stuff, and the whole thing's going to change. I said, and it's because people put their own interpretation on the limited evidence that we have, and then we find more. Oops, our explanation doesn't work, we have to get a different explanation. C.S. Lewis, and I love his writing, he said, in Mere Christianity, he said, we spend too much time fighting over explanations of things. Let's just accept the things.
And if it's not in the Bible, maybe it's irrelevant to us. A lot of this evidence they find is no bigger than this, and they're coming up with this huge story about it.
Yeah, and some of that's, I make fun of some of that stuff in my classes too. But on the other hand, we have a Homo erectus skeleton from Africa that's a complete skeleton of about a 13-year-old boy. I mean, it's only missing a few small bones in the feet. And so it's real. It's not fake. But maybe we don't understand exactly what it is, but it's real.
Been potassium dated?
Been potassium argon dated, and we know how old it is. Called the Narikatomi child. And
Narikatomi, what does that mean?
that's a place where it was found near a village called Narikatomi.
But if you didn't have a way to test, you'd just think it came out of
it exists within
Candies Creek Cemetery.
It exists within the range of modern human variation. So people have been around for a long time. Do I understand all of the ins and outs? No, because God doesn't tell me in the Bible. Sometimes we go to the Bible and ask the Bible to answer questions that just the answers aren't there.
And it's something that King James translated. It may from 2 different languages.
Yeah, and I don't think anything that we can, God gave us these wonderful minds to go and investigate the world. And look at the good things have come of that. I mean, look at all these discoveries we've made, especially in the last 150 years, that have transformed the world. I mean, jet aircraft and, I mean, all this engineering stuff that we've done and everything. We've transformed the world, sometimes in very positive ways, sometimes not such positive ways, but we've done a lot of agriculture, scientific agriculture, feeds 8 billion people, or I know a lot of people suffer from food shortages and stuff, but I mean, the world has more than enough food to feed everybody. We have a distribution problem, but I mean, that's amazing. God gave us minds that can do that by discovering stuff. So I don't think anything we discover is necessarily irrelevant. It might not be important in the immediate context,
sure.
but probably not irrelevant in terms of understanding the world that God has made. I know some people think like paleoanthropology is irrelevant. Why do you need to be fooling around with all those bones in Africa and stuff? Well, it's interesting, and it tells us something about the world God made. Well, do I understand all of it? No, but I'm okay with the mystery.
Do you think there's any civilizations that were really advanced that have been wiped out, like that's Göbekli Tepe? What is it called?
Yeah,
Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I'm trying to remember the pronunciation. It's a Turkish word.
It was in Turkey.
Göbekli
Tepe.
Yeah, and That's a very old. What's unusual about that is it looks like we have basically a tribal group that in a pre-agricultural group that built this. Is very old, and it speaks to people being much more socially sophisticated earlier than we thought they were in that part of the world. That's okay.
And it's like 70,000 years.
Yeah, it's very
and it
old.
was completely covered up.
Yeah. Yeah, you go out there, these tells, these mounds in the Middle East, and stuff gets covered really within a few hundred years. The wind blows this soil over the top of them. They get buried up.
If they ever find an old site that has electrical wiring, then we'll know they were more advanced. But until they find that, I don't know how we could even assume they were more advanced.
But even then, when we talk about more advanced, I mean, like the ancient Egyptians didn't have electricity, but their civilization was very sophisticated. I mean, they measured the rise and the fall of the Nile. They predicted
geometry and all of that
stuff. They predicted their harvest.
But why did they not come up with electricity? And of course, some think they did, with the battery or whatever.
They probably just didn't think they needed it.
That might have been all there was. Just didn't.
I think humans are the same back then as they are now. They certainly had the capability, but also electricity had a lot of precursors that didn't exist in ancient Egypt. I mean, you had this whole development of building interchangeable parts and all that kind of stuff that got people thinking about stuff like that. But
they didn't have that thinking. They didn't have forward assembly lines.
Yeah, they just had a lot of craftsmen doing their work, and it's very sophisticated, though.
I find all this stuff really interesting. Mysteries. I like mysteries, and that's mysterious to me. And then I like to know the psychology behind the why they, why. I enjoy that. So it's interesting to know that maybe if skeletons have not changed really any over time, maybe a little taller, a little shorter, but people haven't changed either, right?
No, I don't think so.
In their general, I mean, do you think go back 70,000 years ago, they were laughing at stuff? Because that's sort of universal, right? Yeah, crying and laughing is universal.
Yeah, I think that when people have language, their cognitive abilities are pretty much the same as today, and I think our problems have always been our problems are with the human spirit or soul. That the source of our problems is we have this in us this tendency to rebel against boundaries and norms, and to a certain degree there's some adaptive ability to that, because like if you're doing the same thing over and over again and it's not working, then it pays to have somebody who'll go, let's break the rules and try something different. Mm-hmm. But when that becomes the norm rather than the exception, that's when you got problems. And like all of our problems today, they're not technological. Our problems today aren't technological. They're all social.
Do you think people always have to have something to be angry about? Like maybe today we're not worried about hunter gathering and how much food we're going to have for the winter and all of that stuff. So we're going to get angry about women in sports and men in sport, men and women's sports, and so maybe we're just creating this stuff to maybe we're a species that has to be angry.
Well, I think you're onto something there. I think that is part of what in anthropology we explanations of misfortune. We call that in traditional anthropology. We call those kind of things witchcraft. It's not that there are witches. It's that people believe there are witches. Why am I having problems? Because there are witches causing these problems. These people over there are causing these problems. In Salem, there were no witches. There were just old ladies that nobody liked. They're the ones who've cursed our...
And that was real, wasn't it?
And they killed those women.
Yeah.
Not because there were witches and not because there was a curse. They were experiencing bad times. Mm-hmm. We're going to blame somebody for the bad times. I think a lot of what's going on in our society right now This group blaming that group.
Well,
It's witchcraft.
It's what Hitler did, I
Exactly.
guess.
It's an explanation of why am I in the situation I am. It's that group over there. That's why I'm in this situation.
If we get rid of them,
Yeah,
we
then
won't have this problem.
And it's happened over and over again throughout history. Witchcraft shows up in human societies all over the world, modern and primitive, and it always is an explanation of misfortune. Why are things? Why did my kids disappear when they went out in the woods? My kid disappeared. What? There must be a witch. We got to find a witch and kill them. Okay, but the kid probably went up, fell off a cliff or something, or got bit by a snake, right? But no, it must be a witch. Why is everybody in the village getting sick? There must be a witch, right?
Somebody must have a disease. We need to find the one with the disease.
So when people don't understand things, they tend to blame somebody. And there's that rage that goes along with the blame.
Then you get mass
hysteria.
hysteria.
Yeah. And that's a scary thing because everybody's wanting to blame somebody. I'm like this because of that. And they personify it and go after it. And that's a scary thing because it can happen anytime, any place.
Now with the internet, if I get on the internet and I'm thinking this one way, I'll keep getting stuff that supports that thinking.
Oh yeah, you get the algorithms.
Yeah.
Link all that stuff together,
they're
reinforce
supporting it, making me think it more and seeing it more, and they can really. They have really started to control us through what we see.
Oh yeah, I mean we don't know where that stuff comes from. I mean they can send into our feeds whatever they want to send into our feed. They can hide from. I mean potentially people who want to control us can hide whatever they want from us, right? And so they control what you see. I'm not paranoid or anything about that. I think that it's a much more chaotic universe out there than that. I don't think any one person's controlling it.
Yeah,
but certainly certain groups are controlling members of their group through this stuff.
Well, I'm like you. I don't think there's a group in the room deciding to do this, but I think that they can. I think that it seems like whatever somebody's thinking seems to get bunched up and solidifies what they're thinking, and the next thing they think everybody needs a new Toyota or something about the politics or so we may have lost the ability to think.
Oh, I think so. We don't take the time to think. There's no time for reflection anymore.
Yeah, it's not an ability. It's maybe just the time.
And we're not trained to do that. I mean, people. I intentionally a long time ago learned that I just have to take time to sit back and think about stuff. But most people don't do that.
What do you do to stop and think? Do you go in the woods, you go on the back porch, or you listen to music, or what do you?
Well, a lot of it has to do when I'm just doing mundane things, when I'm out mowing the grass, and sometimes.
So you don't like.
And in between, when I stop the lawnmower to drink my water, sit there in the lawn chair in the back room. That's when I ruminate on all these, big things.
So mundane task. But mowing yards used to really relax me when I'd sit on the riding lawnmower and put on my hat and ride, and I'm getting something done. I'm not really working that hard. I'm just getting hot.
Yeah, sometimes I sit in my office and just take the time to just think.
Remember the famous saying by Burr Rabbit? It says, sometimes I sits here and thinks, and sometimes I just sits here.
I think that's probably pretty true.
Hey, I appreciate you coming.
Thanks for
You're
asking.
the smartest person I've had here.
Well, that scares me, but